good to be with you as we turn now to the Word. I trust that there will be further blessing in the service for you, and that you will leave here at the end with your heart full of hope and strength and peace. About 8-9 years ago, I was living in the eastern Transvaal town of Middelburg. And for some or other reason, my loneliness at a particular time of year was exacerbated. I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking that anybody who lives in Middelburg will feel lonely whether they're married or not, or whether they're rich or not, or whether they have all the comforts in the world or not. But anyway, I went through a little bit of a loneliness stage somewhere in the winter, because the winters can be quite harsh there. And I thought I need to do something to alleviate that. And the bright spark came to my mind that I would buy for myself, for the first time ever, a goldfish. Somebody to talk to, somebody who I could feed twice a day, somebody that I could nurture and look after for as long as it was alive. Of course, in order to have a goldfish, one has to have all sorts of equipment, like a fish bowl, for instance. So that is where I started. Before rushing off to the pet shop, I thought, let me get a decent bowl. The pet shop had only plastic ones, and you know how classy I am. I wasn't going to have a plastic bowl on my dining room table, so it had to be a very expensive, elegant-looking fish bowl made of glass. So I ideally went to the one boutique shop in Middelburg, and I can't remember if they either had one or if I couldn't afford it, maybe a bit of both. And so I worked my way through a process of elimination, going to the local mall, going to shops that looked that they might have some kind of fish bowl, to no avail. I ended up at Mr. Price Home, believe it or not. With all my fingers crossed and with all my thumbs held, I thought, if this doesn't pay off to any success, I will have to just be lost in my loneliness. To my absolute surprise and joy, there was one bowl right at the back on the last shelf at the bottom. One beautiful, big, brilliant fish bowl, which of course I was going to buy, even if it cost an arm and a leg. The price was quite reasonable, but as the helper put it in a container for me, I noticed that it had a little chip around the edge. And so now I had to make this crucial decision whether I would take it or not. For somebody who only drinks from Noritake cups, that's quite a big crisis to have. You know what I'm saying? A chip in your fishbowl. So we eventually walked from the back of the store to the tills, and I was still not 100% convinced that I would take this imperfect bowl. But this was the only fishbowl to be found in Middelburg, and maybe the entire district, as some of the farming community call that area in that part of the world. So I thought perhaps I could take a bit of Tipex or a bit of super glue or something and make a plan. But when I got to the till, I just got stuck in my step. I thought, you know what? People are going to come and visit me. And they're going to look at Tinkles. Oh, that was the name I chose, and I forgot to put that in there. They're going to look at Tinkles, and they're going to say, what a stunning fish, but what a tarnished bowl. After some discussion with not only the cashier, now it had escalated to me getting hold of the manager, saying to him, Mr. Whoever, his name was probably Julian. You know, their name is always Julian in these places. So I said, Julian, can you please go to the back? There must be a storeroom somewhere. I'm pretty sure that if you can't order one from Witbank, then perhaps you will find somewhere in a lost little shelf, a forgotten little cupboard in the back, you will find a fishbowl for me. I'm 100%. In fact, my heart was just leaning strongly towards it, with an absolute conviction that there was a perfect fishbowl somewhere in the back, set aside for only me. He promised me that there wasn't. And he also kind of half promised me that the Witbank branch would also not have one. So there I was, still not having made up my mind. After me staring at the bowl from every angle, Julian finally wanted to know from me, so, sir, are you going to take it or toss it? So after putting a funny face, I looked him straight in the eye and said to him, may God bless you. And I made a beeline for the door. I had all the drama that one day would allow and could take. As I got to the door, I thought, gosh, I had been a tad bit unjustly treated. So just for good measure, I could still, I could still see his face from the front door. And as I turned around, I just for good measure had to sneak in a, you toss it. For the rest of my stay in Middelburg, I never ever went into that store again. It's an entertaining little story. But I couldn't help but think that somewhere in there, there's a bit of theology to be found. For the take it or toss it line that I didn't think out myself, that came all from Julian. That speaks of the crucial decision that God had to make once upon a time. God had to decide what to do with this deviant world. God had to decide whether he would take it and keep it and treasure it, or if he would squash it between his index finger and thumb and toss it, pretending like it had never existed. It had become so fallen. It had become so imperfect. It had become so stained by human disobedience that no one would have been in a position to blame God if that is what he had opted for. But something called love, sitting deeply entrenched in the heart of God, would never have allowed him to get away with it. God would never have been able to live with himself if he destroyed the world and started over on Mars. For right from the very beginning, God was not only proud of that which he had made, God was also passionate from the very start about this planet and all who lived in it. Scripture tells us that God had always known that making us would backfire. Sometime during the year, I gave to you in a sermon probably what I hold as the most profound theological truth that I have ever spoken or heard. It comes from my professor at university when I was busy with my master's. He was one day lecturing on prevenient grace and predestination and all those kind of words that end with shin, salvation, redemption, liberation, sanctification. And I was very bored in his class, and just before I dozed off, he made a statement that has haunted me for the last 18 years. He said to us as his students that foreknowledge is not foreordination. And at the time, it shocked me, probably because I didn't know exactly what it meant, just as shocked as you look now staring at me. Let me unpack a little bit. What does that heavily loaded theological statement mean? Foreknowledge is not foreordination. It means that the fact that God knows that something is going to happen doesn't mean that God is okay with it. The fact that God can foresee the future, that God had seen long ago that we would turn against Him, didn't mean that God ordained our disobedience. Are you with me? For eons, since Genesis chapter 3, for eons humans have held on to their stubbornness, they have acted proudly, and they have ignored the call of God, saying, not interested. And so God found Himself in a very tight spot, and because of the dynamic of grace, couldn't turn His back on a world that had done that to Him. God's conscience wouldn't have survived. So right before the foundation of the world, Scripture tells us, Jesus was the Lamb slain for our salvation. A salvation plan came into being not when Adam and Eve chose the apple instead of the pear. No, God knew it before time existed. God foreknew it, but would and could never ordain it. And so God, in His perfect wisdom, put together the most strange but the best plan for the redemption of the world. I'm always fascinated by some of the things we see on the adventure channels, on Netflix, for we often see missions being done to save a whole group of people in trouble. Sometimes it's an expedition that has gone awry on the way to the top of Mount Everest. Sometimes it's miners stuck 100, 200, 300 feet underground in a mine in Chile. And the world then watches with bated breath, seeing the mission of rescue being undertaken. And the country's government then trying its very best to save those lives. Never in the history of this planet has there been a greater, a more committed mission than the one launched by Almighty God to get you and me home to Himself. Every single year, when Christmas comes around, my mind boggles. For its message is soul-shattering. And I continue to be baffled. It's not that I don't think about it in April or November, but it's exacerbated during December when we start singing these carols and when we start preaching these sermons of this babe that came to us as the Son of God, the Word made flesh, the Gospel of John calls Him. Saying that the Word was made flesh and made His dwelling among us, full of grace and full of truth. And of course the original Greek means that, this whole bit of made His dwelling among us, the original Greek means He came to pitch His tent there where our tents were standing. He moved into the neighborhood, in other words, and became one of us. Later, as the Gospels were recorded, people would say of Him, "We beheld His majesty." Some of the apostles wrote, "We were eyewitnesses of His glory." In the past week, preparing for today, I've been scratching my head, wondering afresh what it is about the Christmas story that gets to me to this extent. How come it hasn't lost its power over all these years? What is its hold on me? And I've come up with 3 answers. I know it's a bit predictable, but here they are, the 3 points for today. What is it about Christmas that just keeps on haunting me, inspiring me, making me want to be a part of it? I think the first point about Christmas that reaches out to me so profoundly is that it involves the whole world. That when God, He planned His salvation thing, it involved the entire planet. Perhaps particularly the species that had caused Him the most pain. Human beings. In John 3 verse 16 we have that famous conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus. It lasts an entire chapter, and I can just imagine how many sermons have been preached on that passage, how many books have been written on that passage. In fact, Max Lucado, in one of his great works, calls it the numbers of hope. 3 verse 16, in that author's mind, are the numbers of hope. For in that timeless truth, we find that which brings hope to every person. For God so loved the world, Nicodemus was privy to be the first one to hear. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. It must have been easy for Nicodemus to miss, because he was so soaked, so saturated in Jewish tradition, and he would probably have preferred the line to go and to read as, for God so loved the Jewish people. He wanted them to be God's favorites, and He wanted the liberation and the freedom to come to only them. He wanted Israel to be the hoarders of the hope which the gospel would bring. I wonder if he felt a little shattered after that chat with Jesus. But disappointed, or maybe even a little disgusted. It would have been so sweet if Jesus had said, you know what God has in mind is to bring salvation and forgiveness of sins for the remnant of the 12 tribes. My chosen people, the apple of my eye. Meanwhile, God had made the entire world the object of His affection. We cannot base the doctrine of Christmas being for the entire world on only one verse. I would never be that irresponsible as a theologian. So let's look at some other verses that also strongly point to God loving the entire world and God wanting to reconcile the entire cosmos, actually. Paul says in Colossians 1. Cosmos is the Greek word for universe. In Colossians chapter 1, Paul says, in Jesus, God was reconciling the broken cosmos to Himself. God's picture was much more vast than any human at the time could imagine. That Jesus wasn't sent for a specific people at a specific time, living in a specific place. No, God's dream was wilder than anybody would have imagined at the time. And somehow in Jesus, God maneuvers things and God gets it right to make salvation possible for every human who has ever breathed on this planet we call Earth. The third one from the sun. It was Jan Smuts, in his theory of holism, he was a very clever man, that He had this whole theory of holism and wrote some material on how everything is connected, etc., etc. And he made the iconic statement that there's a crack in the universe, and he said there's a crack in the universe and it runs right through me. Not only is the universe deeply fractured, every human being is profoundly fallen. For sin is a powerful thing. It damages the relationship we have with God. And so only God's divine intervention in Jesus could repair and restore that damage. Right back in Genesis chapter 12. So I'm talking about the early days. We have the fall of humanity in Genesis chapter 3. That dark, that dour, that desperate passage where Adam and Eve choose to do their own thing, saying to God, thank you, but no thank you. We can't make a Waldorf salad without apples. What can we say? In Genesis chapter 12, we have the first hint of God having in mind every nation, every tribe, people of every language, color, and culture. For God invites Abraham into an extremely important relationship. It's called a covenant. God says to Abraham, I 6 chapters ago spoke to Noah, sorry. I told him he must build the ark and all of that. We know the details. And I said to Noah, I'm going to one day enter into a covenant with you. And so in Abraham, that's Genesis 6, okay? In God's chat to Abraham, God turns up the volume a notch, and God says, I'm taking another step closer to the covenant, and I'm going to do certain things with you, Abraham. Firstly, your wife's going to have a baby, and he just falls over in hysterics because she was 85 after all. And God says to Abraham, I'm going to give you a country, number one. I'm going to make your descendants a heck of a lot. They're going to be so many, it's going to be like the grains of sand on the beach. Oh, and thirdly, when I bless you, pay attention now, Abraham, when I bless you, I want you to in turn bless all the other nations around you. And a lot of the Old Testament story is about God's people not wanting to be a blessing to those around them. Even as early as Genesis chapter 12, with the call of Abraham, God says, I'm going to pour out an immense blessing on you, but for goodness sake, please don't keep it to yourself. Share it with those around you. But Abraham missed that, seemingly. He missed a whole lot. He misinterpreted what God said. He misheard what God said. And that was the whole mistake. Right from the very beginning, God's intention was to save the world and all its people. You know, we feel so privileged as Christians. I've even heard pastors refer to the church as the new Israel. It's called replacement theology. I wouldn't go as far as that. It's a bit of thin ice for me. Whatever we make of the church, and however we allow ourselves to feel as blessed believers, we must never forget those who don't yet know Jesus. That would be our biggest miss, our biggest mistake. In Matthew chapter 28, Jesus reiterates this whole thing by saying to his disciples, guys, I'm going to jump ship, okay? Don't be too worried. My Spirit is going to look after you. He's going to enable you. He's going to empower you. Everything will be fine. I will get back when the Father decides it's the right time. We know all of that. In Matthew 28 verse 19, Jesus says to his disciples, you're going to continue my work, however. You're going to take over from me. I'm passing on the baton. So therefore, go into all of Jerusalem. Is that what the Great Commission says? Go to the known world. Don't go beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. Is that what Jesus says in Matthew 28? No, Jesus says, go into all the world. That's the commandment. And if you and I allow for the gospel to be lived out in only these four walls, then we are failing present continuous tense. Somewhere in the New Testament, I'm not sure where, I'm getting older, so I've become more forgetful. Somewhere in the New Testament, it doesn't sound like Paul. Could be the book of Hebrews, letter to the Hebrews, where it says that God wants for no one to perish. Another way of saying that would be God wants for everyone to be saved. One of the powerful things about Christmas is that it brings to the fore God's vision of the entire world atoned to Him. The second thing I think gets to me about the Christmas story is probably this whole thing of the mystery of God becoming human. I have through the years struggled to get my mind around it, and now I have to stop that struggle. I will never on this side of glory understand it. Maybe we weren't meant to understand it. Maybe we were just meant to praise. Maybe we were just meant to dance. If we weren't meant to dance, tell me, then why all this music? It was extremely difficult for the early for the early people in New Testament times to come to terms with God in a human body. It was the inconceivable. Yes, of course, the Jews believed that a Messiah would come, so He would take human form. But Jesus didn't tick any of their expectations of what the Messiah should look like, or sound like, or be like. Why do you think it took forever for the Greeks to become converted to Christianity? Because a God in human form to them was completely and utterly unthinkable. But it's just like God to knock us sideways. For the Old Testament is littered with God performing one miracle after the other. And so in Jesus coming to earth, God pulls His most impressive stunt. And God says, peekaboo, I'm here in the flesh. The people living in New Testament times did not so much battle with the concept of the virgin birth as they did with the fact that He was born. Whether He had been delivered by a virgin or not was an optional extra. It was the actual birth that they battled to believe. So when the creeds came to be, the Apostolic Creed and the Nicene Creed, where it's written of Jesus that He was born of the Virgin Mary, it wasn't the virgin birth that caught people unawares. It was the shock that God could actually be born into the material world. There was a group of people who had a funny faith. It's called Docetism, D-O-C-E-T-I-S-M. The Docetists believe that Jesus actually didn't have a real body, for a deity cannot possibly have a body. So they discarded that idea totally. So they believed that Jesus had been an apparition. That Jesus had been, this is the Docetist teaching, that Jesus had been an appearance, but that he was a spirit. You could see him, but that he could move through doors, for instance. And that is how they would have explained how Jesus got into the locked upper room on the night of the resurrection. The church, of course, denied and defied the teachings of the Docetists. Then came along, about what, maybe in the first 200 years of Christianity, another group of Greek knowledgeables. They were called the Gnostics, Gnostic, the Gnostics, and it comes from the word gnosis, which means knowledge. For the Gnostics believed that they knew everything, and they had this theory of dualism. They believed that the spirit world was good, and that the material world was bad and evil. And that is why they couldn't palate this idea that God actually grew a body of flesh and blood. It was just unimaginable to the Gnostic to think that God could have squashed himself and sent and brought his son or himself to earth as a helpless baby. The Gnostics would never ever swallow that. Anything material, the material world, stone or wood or flesh, that was all bad for them. So to say that a holy God became a baby, that was just not an option to believe. It's the dualist theory, as I've explained, which the Gnostics held on to for dear life. The church also negated that teaching. It was only much later where the church could find the right wording to put together its official doctrine. But although we find this the greatest mystery out, Jesus was fully divine and fully man at the same time. And perhaps we shouldn't ask how it works. Perhaps we should just praise, and perhaps we should just dance because we have been the chosen ones. If we weren't meant to dance, then why all this music? There's this beautiful picture which Paul creates in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul says that Jesus was one with the Father in glory, and he creates this image of a V. He talks about how Jesus had to condescend, how he had to come down to our level here, walking on the dusty roads of ancient Jerusalem. And how Jesus stooped down to the lowest of the low, even obedient to death on a cross, Philippians 2 verse 8. Therefore, Paul continues, therefore God has raised him up to the high. Can you see the V forming? Coming down from glory to the lowest of the low, to the death, to death on the Roman cross. And then he ascends to the place of honor and glory, where he now sits at the right hand of God the Father. So there's a whole lot of humanity in there. For while he was down here, he cried like we cried, and he prayed like we prayed, and he doubted like we doubted, when he exclaimed, my God, why have you let me down, or whatever. All the stuff that we go through as humans, he also went through. And I have ad nauseum in sermons quoted passages that let us know that Jesus was human. So I'm not going to talk about how he took a break against the well in John chapter 4 because he was tired. And I'm not going to again talk about how he cried at the death of Lazarus, because I've given you this in sermons. But believe it or not, I have found a new verse which I haven't used in the last 12 months in my preaching, emphasizing the humanity of Jesus. It's in Mark chapter 7, where Jesus finds a deaf man, or perhaps the deaf man finds him, and Jesus, before he makes him whole, looks up to heaven and sighs. What can be more human than a sad sigh? Fully human, fully divine. If you don't understand it, it's okay. Because none of us does. This is why Christmas story is so powerful. And this is why we just cannot get over it. The last thing, do you have 5 more minutes? Hoe laat is die volgende diens, Ken? Oh, okay, so we're fine. My third point. Okay, where we're at. Sorry, I'm getting a bit worked up. All the stuff that I'm saying means everything to me, so I'm preaching from my heart, okay? What's the first thing? The whole world. The second thing? The fact that God actually became a human. And thirdly, I think why Christmas just gets to us every single year, it's probably because deep down we know that the story is far from finished. Yes, it reached a climax 2,000 years ago in the obscure village of Bethlehem. Quite a bit of drama there with shepherds and angels. As if that's not enough, a whole lot of foreigners from the east bringing weird gifts. That was only one of the eventful parts of the story. The story is far from over. For Christmas says that Easter is coming. And Easter says that Pentecost is coming, that the Ascension is coming. And Ascension says that Pentecost is coming. And Pentecost says that there will come a day where the heavens give a thrilling song. Where the clouds open and where He will come back. Perhaps not as a baby, needing milk formula. Perhaps there's not going to be all that stuff again, a repeat of the angels and a repeat of the shepherds and all that stuff. It doesn't look like the second coming is going to involve a manger. No, this time round, it's going to be spectacular. It looks like no one's going to miss it. He Himself says that every eye will see Him. Revelation 1. In Mark chapter 8, He says, the Son of Man will return with a train of angels. Can you in your mind's eye see how breathtaking that will be? And apparently there's going to be a sound of the trumpet according to 1 Thessalonians 4. A sound of a mighty trumpet. And then Paul also runs out of words, and Paul then just ends that bit with saying, we will meet Him in the air. The most endearing passage about the second coming is probably not all that spooky stuff in Revelation. It's not even with all the glitz and the glamour that Jesus talks about in Mark chapter 8. The most heartwarming bit on the second coming is John 14, where Jesus says, there's absolutely no reason to stress. You need to trust me, you need to trust God. I'm going to come back, and I'm going to fetch you, so that you can be there when I am. And you know what? That's enough. I refuse to obsess about the detail of the second coming. Because I am pretty sure that no human vocabulary can succeed in telling exactly what it will be like. Perhaps the short word awesome says it all. And so why Christmas means so much to me is probably because I know, although it's an important part of the story, the incarnation, I know that there's much more to come. And perhaps it would be clever to throw in a quote by John Wesley, who said just before his death, the best of all is yet to come. Jesus has called you His very own. He has gone to ridiculous measures to bring you forgiveness and hope and eternity. Don't make this Christmas only a glorified birthday party. Make this Christmas a real and a true Christ Mass. Christmas is about God saving the whole world. It's about God gobsmackingly becoming one of us. It's a part of a much bigger story, with our names written all over it. God was confronted by this choice because sin had so devilishly contorted the world. Will I take it or will I toss it? God would never have been able to live with Himself if God obliterated us once and for all, like we never existed. God chose, no matter what it took, to take us and to cherish us and to love us without any strings attached. God has gone to this crazy measure of making us His very own. I will take the world, God said, as is, and I will save it, and I will transform it, and I will treasure it forever. If I don't see you tomorrow, a blessed Christmas.